It is a great pleasure for me to introduce someone whose work I respect tremendously and who is also a friend to Brigham Young University. Nabil Matar received his PhD in English from the University of Cambridge in 1976. He has taught at the Florida Institute of Technology, the American University of Beirut, and Jordan University, and since 2007 has been a professor of English at the University of Minnesota. He's an extremely prolific scholar, having authored dozens of publications, including important works such as Turks, Moors, and Englishmen in the Age of Discovery, In the Lands of the Christians, Arabic travel writing in the 17th century, and Europe Through Arab Eyes, 1578 to 1727. More important than the number of publications is their impact. Professor Matar's work has forced a fundamental rethinking among early modern scholars about how we conceive of the Mediterranean and the relationship between Muslims and Christians. Previous generations of scholars held that Muslims and Arabs were uninterested and unengaged in Europe, and as a result produced no writing similar to the voluminous travel literature generated by European travelers in this same period. Professor Matar's elegant and deeply researched work has shown that the exact opposite of this was true. He has demonstrated the intensity of Muslim interactions with Europe and has excavated a large and fascinating body of Arabic documents that illustrate this engagement from throughout the Mediterranean. One of the areas that has been a focus of his study is Mediterranean slavery, and particularly the rich body of captivity narratives that it has produced. He was drawn to this topic after his own harrowing experience with captivity. In May 1986, during a time in the Lebanese Civil War, characterized by extreme sectarian conflict, while walking to work at the American University of Beirut, he was abducted by a militant group that was kidnapping Christians in an effort to force Lebanese Christian militias to release Muslim prisoners that they were holding. Professor Matar was held captive for 6 months until, through the efforts of his wife and many others, on October 20th, 25 years ago to this day, actually, he was released and walked onto the campus of the university to the astonishment of his students and colleagues. So we are grateful that Professor Nabil Matar has chosen to commemorate this dramatic episode in his own life with us this morning, and we are honored to have him present the 2011 D. Lamar Jensen lecture entitled The Arabs and the World on the Eve of the Napoleonic Invasion.
Thank you so much, Eric, for the introduction and for graciously taking me yesterday to a wonderful dinner. I also want to thank Professor De Lamar Jensen and his wife for being here and for endowing this possibility of visiting the university and delivering this lecture in his honor, and I'm truly humbled by that. It's wonderful, as I said, as Eric mentioned, this is a very propitious day for me. It's lovely to be here on this absolutely beautiful campus, also near mountains. I just kind of was telling Ed that, living for 21 years in Florida, and now this is my 5th year in Minnesota, these are very flat states. And coming here and seeing mountains reminds me of Lebanon, which to me is kind of quite an old memory. Thank you all for coming. I also appreciate students coming. I've lectured in front of large audiences, but usually students who were dragged in because they had to. So I don't know about you guys here, but I gather you're here of your own free wills, so I appreciate that very much. Right. The Arabs in the world on the eve of the Napoleonic invasion. The French Revolution was the first European movement of social and intellectual transformation to leave an impact on the Islamic world. For 9 years after 1789, the forces of that revolution reached the Arab East as Napoleon and his armies and navies invaded Egypt and Palestine. From that year on, changes began, specifically in Egypt, which led to extensive interactions with French institutions and with European culture, thus heralding the beginnings of the Arab Nahda, the Arab Renaissance. So how did the Arabs see themselves before the beginning of what Eric Hobsbawm has called the Age of Revolution and the imperial rivalry between France and Britain. The question was asked by Albert Hourani, distinguished professor of history, who passed away in the 1990s, in 1956, who wondered whether the region of the Fertile Crescent had been, quote, decaying or lifeless, end of quote, before the arrival of the modern West, and whether the Nahda, the Renaissance, was something totally new or a development, quote, of movements already generated in the very heart of Near Eastern society, end of quote. The question has generated extensive debate, with some scholars arguing with Hourani that much intellectual activity and economic change was ongoing before Napoleon's arrival, and others, starting with George Antonius, arguing that there was really nothing changing and that the Arabs were decaying and lifeless until woken up by the artillery of Napoleon. Today I will ask Hourani's question again and focus not on the Fertile Crescent alone, but on the whole Islamicate world of the Arabs, from Morocco to Yemen. In particular, I will turn to the writings of the Arabs themselves to see what they thought and said, rather than what outsiders, be they Turkish administrators or European observers, decided about them. As I hope to show, the records of Arab travelers and biographers, jurists and priests, Muslim and Christian, present an Islamicate world of tremendous diversity and space that produced a rich legacy of writings. The Arabs were not lifeless, but it was a legacy that looked inward rather than outward, and to a large extent that remained confined within its religio-cultural parameters. From 1517 on, the Ottomans ruled the region from Syria to Arabia and Algeria, beginning what one historian has called the period of Pax Ottomanica. The peoples in this region were Arabic speakers, largely Muslim, but with a sizable Orthodox and Catholic Christian population, as well as a Jewish minority. These Arabic speakers became part of the Ottoman world, influenced the Turks at the same time that they were influenced by them. The only Arabic-speaking population that remained unaffected by Turkish Ottoman power was the Moroccan. To evaluate the conditions of these societies, I will turn to three groups of Arabic writers from three different geographical angles of the Mediterranean basin. These are, first, Muslim writers from Morocco and the Islamic West and Maghreb, Eastern Christian writers from Bilad al-Sham, Greater Syria, and third, Muslim writers from Bilad al-Sham and the Islamicate world. Each group gave expression to a view of the world that was generated by its unique location and experience. The Moroccans wrote about Western Europe, Spain, Italy, Malta, and Sicily, as well as about the Ottoman Empire, from Istanbul via Jerusalem to Mecca. The Eastern Christians of Bilad al-Sham wrote about Central and Western Europe, and about Syria, Palestine, and Sinai, regions of pilgrimage and migration, while their Muslim brethren described the whole world of Islam, from Morocco to India, and from Bosnia to Yemen. All in all, the Arabs reveal familiarity with two parts of the globe, Western Europe on a limited scale, and the Islamicate empires of the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals on a large scale. Only one writer, an Iraqi priest, saw and wrote about Central and South America. Although Moroccan ambassadors to Spain recorded in their memoirs what they had heard about America, for all intents and purposes, America was not yet discovered. And if I know how to work this, these are two maps from the 18th century by Katib Shalabi in the Siyahnama, which was published, one of the first publications, actually, first prints in the Islamic world. And I just have two maps, and they're actually quite stunning in terms of colors. This is basically the world they knew. This is the Mediterranean. I gather I can use that. So basically Mediterranean region, and this is kind of, Spain, Italy, France, and Russia here. And obviously that's the Eastern Mediterranean. and that's the other part. I mean, if we extend that, we go down to the to Arabian Peninsula. This is Egypt, and then all the way to India. So my point is that they kind of recognize, or they knew the world from this point all the way to the Atlantic Ocean of Morocco. All the writers, Muslim and Christian alike, shared in the commonality of the Arabic language, thereby giving expression to a distinctively Arabic perspective, quite different from Turkish. And all the writings appeared in an Arab-Islamic culture that was still without print. As I say, this is one of very early prints of 1732, which is why writers had little reason to embellish or exaggerate. Very, very few writers included the preposterous or outlandish descriptions. Rather, the writings are empirical and informative, and altogether reveal a world in which jurists and ambassadors, priests and teachers, merchants and carpenters frequently traveled to Western Europe and Russia, to Bosnia and Iraq, Anatolia and Arabia, all the way to Hadramaut and Hyderabad in India. It was an open landmass that witnessed numerous localized conflicts and military confrontations, but never anything as vast as the 30 Years' War or the devastating intercontinental and internaval wars between France and Britain at the end of the 17th and the beginning of the 18th century. It was relatively a safe land mass, much more so in Arabic imagination than the sea, which is why there was no Mediterranean basin in the Arabic experience, and why there are very few references to the sea in Arabic histories or chronicles. The world through Moroccan eyes. This is category 1. Inhabitants of the regencies of Libya, Tunisia, and Algeria, so we're basically talking about here, as well as the Kingdom of Morocco, all the way to the end, were in close proximity to European port cities at the same time that traders from Cadiz and Marseille, Cadiz would be somewhere here, and Marseille, well, I don't know how we're going to point that, somewhere in southern France, Valletta and Malta here, and Syracuse in Sicily, and from the latter part of the 16th century on, London and Portsmouth docked in Tripoli or Tunis, Tetuan or Salé at regular intervals. There was commerce and piracy, friendship and chicanery, multilingual unity, and even marriage. Perhaps not untypical of sailors in those days, a different wife and family in different ports. Euro-Christians were part of North African interaction, so much so that numerous jurisprudential decisions focused on their legal needs, along with entries pertaining to business relations with, quote, the traders from among the Christians and the Jews, end of quote. At the same time, and quite effectively, the Europeans were sending, and the North Africans were demanding, the novelties of material culture. There are dozens of lists of gifts that were sent by British and French emissaries to Moroccan and Algerian rulers, effecting thereby a transfer of European domestic culture and consumer goods. One example will suffice. The British consul to Tunis in 1730, for instance, presented the Bey with a desk, a bookcase, Japan cabinet, a telescope, a reading glass, eyeglasses, and 2 gorgons, can't figure out what they are, a Japan cabinet, and green tea. For the Kahia, the kind of military commander, he sent 12 chocolate cups, a silk handkerchief, and to others in the court, he sent kaftans and brocade, teapots and coffee pots, decanters, and crystal mugs. Similar lists of gifts go back as far as the end of the 1570s and continue well into the modern age. Consumerism had reached North Africa. Arabic writers about Western Europe were by far fewer than the English, the French, the Dutch, and the Italian writers about the Islamic world, which is why Muhammad ibn Uthman al-Miknasi is important and unique. Al-Miknasi, who comes from Miknas, a city in Morocco, who died in 1799, is the only Arabic writer who visited Western Europe, Spain, Malta, Sicily, and the Kingdom of Naples, and the Ottoman East, all the way to the holy cities of Jerusalem, Mecca, and Medina. And he wrote about those travels. McNassie visits Spain in 1779, Malta, Sicily, and Naples in 1781, and Istanbul and Jerusalem and Arabia in 1786. In Spain, McNassie was shocked. Spain was a land that had once been Muslim, but had been subsequently Christianized. Not only had the Muslims been expelled, unlike the Christians in Muslim lands, but also the Muslim legacy had been obliterated and desecrated. At the same time that churches in Egypt and Syria and Palestine still flourished. Al-Miknasi therefore inveighed against the occupiers and the desecrators, especially as he saw how they had tarnished the purity of mosques with their chapels and idolatries. In the mosques of Cordoba and Toledo, where Counter-Reformation zeal had wrought havoc on the architecture, adding incongruent partitions and destroying the pristine harmony of the buildings, Al-Miknasi was most furious. He was disgusted to find the minaret of the Seville mosque turned into a latrine where he had, quote, to hold his nose in order to continue his climb, end of quote. But McNassie did not generalize in his denunciation. While he declaimed against the Spaniards of old, he recognized that the Bourbon dynasty ruling Spain during his visit and since 1700 had had nothing to do with the past. And toward those Spaniards, in the figure of King Carlos III, who had welcomed and hosted him, he responded with dignified gratitude. There were bad Spaniards and good Spaniards, and it was appropriate that each would elicit a different response. Al-Miknasi was impressed with what he saw among them, and he wrote in praise, from Spanish agricultural innovation to machines for drawing water out of wells, to new olive presses, to magnificent buildings, including the Reales Alcazares in Seville, to the king's social engineering, by which new regions were populated. The words gharaib and ajaib, wonders and marvels, recur in his account, sometimes at the beginning of consecutive paragraphs, about water parks and mechanical fountains, gardens, roads and bridges, sculpture and military museums, postal service, and the Escorial, quote, one of the wonders of the world, end of quote. The appearance of women among the welcoming parties proved deeply perplexing to Al-Miknasi. He was shocked to see the intermingling of men and women, not only in the streets, but also on dance floors. At first, he did not know how to respond to women who came up to chat with him or sing before him. Nor did he know how to react to plays or operas, musicals or comedias, which took him by complete surprise. Be that as it may, he was fulsome in his praise of the Spanish king, who was releasing Muslim captives and eagerly encouraging trade with Morocco. Interestingly, in the same breath, Al-Miknasi denounced with bitterness the unwillingness of the Ottoman rulers in the adjacent regencies, Algeria basically, to ransom Arab captives. Muslim ransomers from Istanbul or any of the Ottoman-dominated regencies of Algeria and Tunisia always freed Turkish captives, but ignored Arabs, forgetting the words of the Quran and the Prophet about the duty of liberating all co-religionists. Al-Miknasi could not but admit that the Christian king had been kinder than the Muslim Turks. A year later, 1781, Al-Miknasi went on another mission to 3 different regions of the European Mediterranean. In the second account, Al-Miknasi begins to see himself as a travel writer, a chronicler of different cities and countries of the world. He is the first Arab writer on record to begin to view travel and travel writing not as mere diplomatic report, but as an avenue for information and transformation. In this account emerges for the first time the Arab Muslim traveler as a teacher about foreign European history, culture, and wonder. Al-Miknasi was very interested in describing to his readers everything he saw. As he explained, quote, "It is better to know something than to be ignorant of it," end of quote. By far more than in previous account, he focused on the wonders of buildings, parks, and palaces, so much so that the text often reads like a tour guide. Having spent a year in Spain, he had become familiar with European ways and no longer found the presence of women and wives among the welcoming parties embarrassing. Actually, in Naples, he found himself enjoying their company. He learned to salute them with amused respect. Quote, I returned her greeting with my hand, and she returned it. So I returned it, and then she returned it. We did that 3 times. End of quote. Indeed, al-Miknasi became so relaxed about his view of women that he slipped into a temptation in which other ambassadors before him had slipped, falling in love. Ahmad ibn Qasim, the first Muslim traveler to Holland and France in the early 17th century, fell in love with a French woman. And at the end of the 17th century, Abdullah ibn Aisha too. After seeing an opera singer perform in Naples, al-Miknasi became infatuated with her voice and beauty. She appeared on the stage, quote, in a white dress like a halo around the moon, end of quote. Bewildered, he sublimated his emotions by reciting poetry to her, reflecting his pain and despair. When he realized that he had fallen for her, he called on God to help him find an escape, and he left the opera, quote, before tripping and becoming entangled by the ropes of love, end of quote. Such entanglement did not face Miknasi during the third and final journey, this time to the Ottoman Empire between 1786 and 1788. There's no record of the period under study of any other Arab writer having seen and written about the 2 worlds of Christendom and Islam. Al-Miknasi traveled to Istanbul and down to the holy cities of Jerusalem, Mecca, and Medina, and then back to Morocco. His account of the journey shows a variety of different attitudes and emotions. Traveling in Islamic lands, he was understandably more relaxed, notwithstanding his frequent disaffection with Turkish practices. He detested their constant drinking of coffee, which evidently had not made its way to Morocco. And he thought their court ceremonials were apish imitations of the Europeans. He criticized their poor administration, corruption, and brutalization of the local Arab population. Near Jerusalem, the people complained to him about the yoke of the Ottoman administrators and their tadallum, their tyranny. In Algeria, he lamented how the Turks had allowed the famous city of Tlemcen to fall into ruin, kharab, while the Prince of Algiers, a Turk, did not bother to ransom North African captives, of whom there were thousands in Spain. Al-Miknasi was not impressed, but he was comfortable. The Islamic world was united by Sufi orders that cut across linguistic divisions, saints whose tombs dotted the pilgrimage routes, and a scholarly legacy that united a geographically and a vast multi-ethnic and multilinguistic republic of letters. The journey took him back to the history of the early rise of Islam, especially in the regions of Syria and Palestine, with their many tombs of the companions of the Prophet, which may well explain why, notwithstanding the years he spent in European travel, al-Miknasi mentioned nothing of his past experiences in this account. The only times he remembered Europeans was in regard to the piratical danger that they posed to North African travelers and to their expulsion of Muslims from Spain just under 2 centuries earlier. Whatever he had admired about the Spaniards or the Maltese or the Sicilians could not override the horror of their past treatment of his co-religionists or their present threat. Throughout his travels, al-Miknasi wavered between being a diplomat, an ethnographer, and a chronicler, by far more than the 2 Moroccan writers who had traveled in Spain in that same century. There's little doubt that much as he tried to show restraint in his writings, al-Miknasi was changed by his travels. After his European journeys, he returned to his country, having realized that the dunya, the world of the Europeans, should not be ignored in an exclusive favor of the deen, the religion of the Muslims. That there were innovations and institutions that were admirable despite their foreignness. Although he and other Magharibis did not formulate a worldview into which they fitted the Europeans in the manner in which the British, the French, the Dutch scholars did about the world of Islam, their descriptions of the various Christians show how relations were not always oppositional. That while there were battles and kidnappings, captivity and humiliation, there was also diplomacy, amicability, cooperation, and negotiation. That in the same manner there were different perspectives in European literature about early modern Islam and Muslims, so were there different views and emotions in Magharibi writings about early modern Europeans. The world through Eastern Christian eyes. Al-Miknasi and other travel writers from North Africa are unique in the annals of early modern Arab Islamic history for having traveled to Western Europe and left descriptions of the world they saw. Interestingly, the other groups that left descriptions of Western and Central Europe were the Eastern Christians, Orthodox and Catholic. But unlike the Moroccans, these were Ottoman subjects. It bears noting that inside the borders of the Ottoman Empire lived the largest indigenous Christian population in the world outside Western Europe. In the Eastern Mediterranean, this was an Arabic-speaking population fully integrated into the social and historical geography. This population had grown since the Arab conquest of the 7th century. And by the way, there had been Christian Arabs in the armies of the first conquerors. And it's rather odd that in Western historiography, we often teach that Christendom began with Charlemagne. But when Charlemagne was being proclaimed Holy Roman Emperor over Christendom, whatever that was at the time, there were more Christians living in the Islamicate world from Baghdad to Jerusalem to Cairo than there were in Western Europe. And since the end of the 15th century, also in the Islamicate empires, there was the largest Jewish population in the world. In the Ottoman Empire, Christians and Muslims lived cheek by jowl, from Alexandria to Mosul and from Aleppo to Istanbul, learning each other's customs and sharing in baths and markets, and sometimes courts and shrines. But these Eastern Christians were alone among the Ottoman population to learn about European Christendom. The first Turkish account about Western Europe, about France, was written in 1720. At the risk of generalizing, I would say that the Orthodox Christians, followers of the Patriarchy of Aleppo and Antioch, to generalize, I would say that they were the ones to learn about Russia. And the Catholics were the ones to learn about Italy and France. Like their Muslim counterparts who traveled around the Islamic world in pilgrimage or in search of work, so did the Eastern Christians, go on pilgrimages in Palestine and Sinai, visit Moscow, study in Rome, train in Paris, and attend church councils wherever these councils occurred. They went as ecclesiastical delegates, often marketing their knowledge of Eastern languages, Arabic, Syriac, Hebrew, Coptic, and others. The world they described in their writings reflected the perspective of monks and priests, ascetics. How Christians fared under the Turks is a topic that has always been approached from the angle of their dhimmi status. In an essay on dhimma in early Islam by C.E. Bosworth, he observed the following, quote, although protected by the contract of dhimmi are the kind of people of the book, Christians and Jews, the dhimmis were never anything but second-class citizens in the Islamic social system, tolerated in large measure because they had special skills, such as those of physicians, secretaries, financial experts, etc., or because they fulfilled functions which were necessary but obnoxious to Muslims, end of quote. This and other similar views have been advanced by scholars of the Christian minority in the early modern Ottoman Empire. That the minorities of the empire did not have the same privileges or opportunities as the Muslim majority, and that they were marginalized and sometimes maltreated, is not contested, especially if attention is paid to the writings of the European visitors. With very few exceptions, these visitors, cum writers, relentlessly described, quote, the persecution and the torture and the forcible conversion of the Eastern Christians, at the same time that they denounced those same Christians for their superstitions from the Protestant view or their stubbornness from the Catholic view. But if we consider a couple of examples from the Orthodox side of the coin, we meet with a community that was religiously and culturally active, producing and translating hundreds upon hundreds of manuscripts about comparative religion, biblical exegesis, homiletics, liturgies, church council histories, and other material. For instance, a treatise on comparative religion discusses theological differences with Islam, but differences are not presented as avenues to cultural opposition or subversion. Bahjatul Mu'min, the happiness of the believer, was written by, quote, the noble sheikh and perfect philosopher Abdullah ibn al-Fadl al-Antaqi, and transcribed by Thalja, brother of Meletius, metropolitan of Aleppo, in the year of the Hijrah, 1032. End of quote. He does not include a Christian date indicating integration into the Islamic calendar. The treatise is translation from Greek into the language of the Arabs, Lughat al-Arab, and is in the form of a question, followed by the word jawab, answer. Underlined in red, with answers starts with the word qul, say, to your interlocutor. The translator explains that he found members of his community, of his congregation, inquiring about certain ideas and expressing wrong views. Kufr sarih, false views. So he decided to write the treatise for the benefit of the educated. The questions vary widely, from a discussion of the four elements and creation ex nihilo to how man is in the image of God and other philosophical and doctrinal matters. Some questions are presented as if they came from Muslim interlocutors, and the answers reveal neither insecurity nor anger, just a calm explanation of doctrine and of the Christian worldview in over 200 beautifully written folios, all in the year 1032 AH, after the Hijrah, which is Anno Domini 1623, over 100 years after the Ottoman conquest. And this manuscript is one among many. There we think of parallels by Native Americans in America, who had been conquered by European Christians just about a quarter of a century before the Ottoman invasion of 1517. Bulus, Paul, son of Macarius, the patriarch of Aleppo, wrote a travelogue in which he described various scenes of socio-religious cooperation in the Ottoman dominions. Muslims, Christians, and Jews went to the shrine of one Sheikh al-Bakr in Aleppo to celebrate the arrival of special water brought from Persia to repel locusts. At the head of the procession were the Muslims, who were singing, followed by Christians chanting in Greek, and altogether they went around the wall of the city in a most orderly fashion. Attending the celebrations of Easter, the Sultan, reported Bulus, quote, enjoyed them so much that he gave 1,000 piastres to the congregation. There were numerous manifestations of such interreligious activities, especially around saints venerated by both Christians and Muslims alike. I think that's where I will turn to this icon. Nothing really captures the mood of interreligious symbiosis better than the stunning icon of the Stylites Simeon, the elder, and Simeon the younger, painted by Na'mi al-Musawwir in 1699 for the Church of Notre Dame de Bellemande in northern Lebanon. Two Muslims, identified by their turbans, they are here and that's that, are shown in what is a rare appearance of Muslims in an Arab Christian icon. You find it in Romanian icons, but not in anything that I've seen in the Arabic tradition. As one scholar said, to the left of the column of Simeon, the elder can be seen a worthy Arab gentleman with his servant, who approaches the saint while raising his hand. End of quote. The worthy Arab, this guy, appears to be importuning the saint, perhaps a reflection of current Muslim veneration for Christian ascetics, going all the way back to the Quran and its veneration, quote, of the men whom neither commerce nor trade distracts from the remembrance of God. End of quote. That's Quran 24:36. He's standing at a distance from the columns, but his hand is gesturing in the direction of the older Simeon, and his eyes are looking up, significantly turbaned. Figures are not at all part of icon representations in other traditions. In the Catholic tradition, we also have numerous texts describing the encounter and the experience of the West. And basically, one text that I want to describe very quickly is an account of written by a priest in 1672 in Aleppo. And it's an account about the wars between Holland and France. In Arabic, written by a priest, for whom and by whom remains a big question, but it describes the progress of the battles, and it clearly has a very, very strong Catholic content. It provides an accurate description of wars in Western Europe in the early 1670s. As I say, why this account should have been written is not terribly clear. The account was obviously intended to discredit the Dutch, who had challenged all the tribes of the Franks, because the war was between the Dutch and the French. The Dutch were still active in trade in the Ottoman Empire, and both France and England were eager to cut them out of that trade. Showing them in military defeat might serve to turn the local population of Aleppo, that major multinational city in the empire, against them. Also, as the author explains, the land of the Dutch was full of the religion of, quote, the damned Calvin, may God humiliate him on the day of judgment, end of quote. The French victory, explained the text, was sure to strengthen the Catholic priests in their religious mission of undermining Protestant proselytizing in the Arab East. Without knowing it, the Arabic-speaking Christians of the Ottoman Empire were becoming part of European war, commercial rivalry, and missionary competition. The world through Eastern Muslim eyes. Coming now to the third group, the Muslim populations of the East, the knowledge of the world was focused on the vast regions of Islam. And we go back to the map, basically that. There are numerous accounts of pilgrimages and some accounts of journeys to Istanbul, the administrative center of the Ottoman Empire. But the sources that I think present us with an overview of their world are the biographical dictionaries, chief of which were two that were written at the end of the 17th and the 18th century. One by Muhammad ibn Fadlallah al-Muhibbi, who died in 1699, and the other is by Muhammad Khalil al-Muradi, who died in 1791. Al-Muhibbi was a contemporary of Anthony Wood, who compiled the biographical dictionary of the graduates of Oxford University. The similarities between their two projects are striking, in that both relied on personal information, documented material, and oral communications. But in the case of the two Arab biographers, they did not just focus on the men of one institution, Oxford University, but on the men who belonged to Sufi orders and madrasas, to government offices and religious institutions, and to scholarly and jurisprudential professions. And so in the same way that we can study the history and the character of Oxford through Anthony Wood, we can also study the history and the character of the Arabic-speaking world through al-Muhibbi and al-Muradi. Both men were based in Damascus. Both collected hundreds upon hundreds of biographies. In the case of al-Muhibbi, around 1,400 entries, and al-Muradi, around 1,000 entries. The biographies were all of men. There's only one woman, ranging in length from few lines to multiple pages, in which they recorded everything about the subject: birth, education, travel, profession, family, teachers, mentors, conflicts, writings, readings, schools attended, Sufi orders joined, idiosyncrasies, virtues, vices, miracles, and death. And not only death, but where the subject was buried, what time of day, who participated in the funerals, near whom he was buried, and whether people still visited his gravesite. As far as I know, neither worked for the Ottoman FBI. But it's tempting to see these two men as a panopticon of a cohesive and interlinked Arabic-speaking world, which could be encompassed from one observation point. It was a world of extensive information networks where a resident in Damascus, like al-Muhibbi, knew about rulers in India, or scholars in Jerusalem, or siege operations in Crete, or poems recited in Fez. He and others like him were surveyors and monitors, and they could do so because the world from Morocco to India was open and accessible. Such openness was possible because the world was under the authority of the Ottomans. The Ottomans provided continuity and contiguity over a vast region, which meant that opportunities and movements were vast. For the Arabic-speaking subjects of the Ottoman Empire, the world revolved around axial cities: Istanbul, Constantinople, Damascus, Jerusalem, Cairo, Mecca, and Medina. Nearly every man in the dictionaries lived or studied or traded in one or more of those cities. Other cities included Gaza and Nablus in Ad-Diyar al-Muqaddasa, the Holy Lands, Tripoli, Aleppo, Bursa. Further west into Europe, there are references to Bosnia, Crete, Malta, Sofia, and Belgrade. The Islamic Maghreb is there, particularly Morocco. East of Damascus and Jerusalem, the road was open to Baghdad after its Ottoman reconquest in 1638. And from Mecca and Medina to Yemen, especially to Tarim, the theological, juridical, and academic center of the Hadramaut Valley, and then to and from India. All those who traveled were men. In the tomes of the two biographers, only one woman is mentioned. There are references to wives and mothers, some rather forward in their behavior, as well as the hundreds of women who used to visit the ascetic of Damascus, for instance, Hassan al-Ghariq, or those who participated in the funerals of pious men. The one woman mentioned by al-Muradi was a poetess who lived in Istanbul, Zubaydah. She was a voracious reader, studied the Quran, literature, and jurisprudence, and wrote poetry in Persian and Turkish. She became so famous that she was given permission to enter poetry contests with men, after which her poetry appeared in a volume that included her father's and brother's verse. But while, as we recall, European women fascinated and attracted al-Miknasi, no Arab writer described the women of their own communities, nor any of the numberless women who traveled from as far as Baghdad and Tetuan to Mecca and Medina on pilgrimage. No biographer wrote about women, although other sources, especially pilgrimage accounts from Morocco, sometimes referred to the women cutting across deserts and tumbling on camelbacks. All these men traveled in pursuit of ilm, knowledge. Of the 1,290 biographies by al-Muhibbi and of the 1,290 biographies by Muhibbi, 1,100 are about scholars wandering in a world of high theological and jurisprudential specialization. A student who wanted to master al-Bukhari, compiler of one of the two standard collections of the Hadith, for instance, would seek the best teacher, even if that teacher lived thousands of miles away. He would pack up and leave. And he was not alone. When al-Maqirri, who was Moroccan, lectured in Damascus, thousands attended from as far as India. On his last day of lectures in 1628, and he dies a year later, al-Muhibbi reported that tears ran down like rivers among his devotees. Also included in the quest for ilm was a visit to libraries or shrines of eminent scholars. In a fascinating biographical dictionary about 18th century Jerusalem, the author described Muslims flocking to the holy city not only to visit the Dome of the Rock, but also to offer prayers at sites associated with prophets of Judaism and Christianity. Hassan ibn Abdullah al-Husayni described men from all over the Islamic world gathering at prayer niches, which he and other Muslims associated with David, Moses, or St. George the Khadr. Even the Iraqi woman Sufi, Rabi'a al-Adawiyya, famous for her asceticism in the 8th century, had a corner where pilgrims offered prayers. Obedient to Quranic teachings, Husayni celebrated with Muslim travelers the monotheistic revelations of Al-Quds al-Bahiyya, the glittering Jerusalem. So what was the world, according to the Arabic speakers before Napoleon? Start with the lands of the Christians. As we have seen, only Moroccans in the Western Mediterranean wrote about European lands and people. And judging from al-Miknasi and the 5 other Moroccan writers before him, it's safe to say that he and the court to which he addressed his writings viewed European regions not from the prism of religion and clashing civilization, but from the prism of historical and diplomatic relations. When they expressed hostility, it did not stem from structural polarization as much as from specific events and deeds. And when they fell in love, then only God could help them. The Eastern Christians wrote about Central and Western Europe. Because of religious proximity, they did not feel too anxious about the foreign surroundings, although Catholics seem to have been more comfortable than the Orthodox. The accounts by these Arabic Christians were unique in the Ottoman Empire, which is why it remains a mystery as to why the Ottoman administration never made use of their writings in diplomatic and political negotiations. The lands of Islam. The lands of Islam furnished economic and education opportunities for people to travel and relocate in a largely unified cultural and linguistic space. A man could be born in Damascus, study in Cairo, practice medicine in Istanbul, seek jurists in Jerusalem, enjoy or declaim against tobacco in Aleppo, drink coffee in Tripoli, teach chess in Bursa, and chess was very popular, by the way, fight in Crete, wander in Salonika, write about astrology or alchemy in Kashmir or Hyderabad, and die in Medina or Sana'a or Musa. The world was Sunni Ottoman, excepting Morocco and India, although both Sunni too. But al-Muhibbi included biographies of Shiite men and the Darawish, the dervishes, from among the poor of the Ajam. But while the Maghariba were very conscious of the changes occurring just straight away from them, although they did not adopt them, the Eastern Arab Muslims appear self-sufficient. There is not a single mention of any European country in the thousands of pages of biographical dictionaries, except Malta, because that's where they captured. There is no allusion to modern science or industrial development, nor are there descriptions or adaptations of European inventions. There's no mention of geographical discoveries, of navigation and the peoples of the New World. This absence of information is not because the Arabs were not curious, as had been disingenuously stated, but because they did not need those lands. We should remember that the English or the Spanish or the French traveled not because they were curious, but because they needed to eke out a living. They ventured not to learn, but to make money, or to seize a homestead from the Native Americans or the South Africans or the Indians of the subcontinent. Meanwhile, Arabic Muslims could make a comfortable living in their own huge multi-ethnic Islamicate space. It's, however, this space and cultural cohesion that militated against change. I started by mentioning Al-Batrani, who argued that in the 18th century, quote, the increased influence of the West in commercial as well as in political life, as also in the minds of men, entered as a factor that changed the lives of the people of the Fertile Crescent, end of quote. This influence may have well been felt by the Christian travelers, but their impact on the region was so minimal. There is no reference to a single Christian in any of the Muslim-authored biographical dictionaries, in vast contrast to the medieval Muslim-authored dictionaries, where Jews and Christians were always present. Nor did any Christian write about geography or science, or translate works about physics or medicine or astronomy. Meanwhile, the open space of the Eastern Muslims was totally self-confined, intellectually productive, but not innovative, curious, traveling far and wide, but never crossing boundaries of religion, tradition, or community. Napoleon's artillery woke the Arabs up, as George Antonius wrote in 1933, and so did American artillery, since the US fleet attacked Libyan Tripoli 3 years after Napoleon. With artillery came the exposure to scientific modernity and religio-political reform, about which many 19th century Arab travelers wrote enthusiastically. But unbeknownst to them, the artillery brought colonial design, Orientalism, and the fragmentation of their geography.